The term African art is typically used to describe traditional art from countries in Africa located south of the Saharan desert. This means that the hieroglyphics and artifacts of Egyptians are not included in the classification of African tribal art. The history of African art is so old we can't put a date on it. Why? Not only because it dates back before recorded history, but also because the oldest pieces were made from things like wood and may have rotted or been destroyed by termites over time. So what remains of this ancient art? Rock art was discovered in Nigeria, showing cavings that were 6,000 years old, the earliest surviving textiles back to the 1st century, the oldest known sculptures dating back to about 500 BC to 500 CE are those of Nok culture from West Africa. For example, take a look at this 6th century Nok sculpture made from terracotta. So now that you've got an idea of some of the earliest art in the planet, let's look at the different types of African art and see how it is important. If you're to visit a museum, a majority of African tribal art that you see would be masks, statues, and textiles. Today we rely on these items to give us a real sense of what the people of Africa were like 1,000 years ago. They tell us more than words in a textbook alone can, because they allow us to touch and feel a piece of their history, and their history is our history, right? If we trace back to the history of human life and find the oldest bones and fossils are from Africa, then in many ways African art is the history of all humans. Without these art pieces, we would not know there are these cultures as we do. In other words, when you see how modern art could have great importance in our societies, who would have lived 2,000 years in the future. Examples of art. So let's pretend we're in a museum in the African tribal section. What do we see? We have already said it's masks, textiles, statues, but what are these objects? Of course, these objects weren't skyscrapers, robots, or cars. Rather, they were creating images of their own place and time. Sculptures and carvings, such as masks, were mainly of people, their natural surroundings, and animals. Textiles were mainly geometrical patterns, and their masks were primarily the faces of people, specifically ancestors. Let's talk a bit more about these 3 examples. So no, African tribal art were not worn as costumes on Halloween or the masquerade balls. Masks are a part of the African tribal art that were known to have ceremonial role. They were the faces of ancestors and were used in initiation celebrations and rituals, often as a way to communicate with one's ancestors. It was so strongly believed that the person wearing the mask was possessed by the spirit of the ancestor. In this way, the role of the African art was more than just to decorate and adorn the space with beauty. It was also to serve a spiritual and ceremonial purpose. Most traditional African sculptures were made of wood and other natural materials, which due to decomposition did not survive very well over time. Therefore, the oldest examples of sculptures from wood are only a few centuries old. However, much older collections of statues were made from terracotta, stone, ivory, or metal. Many of these statues were decorated and used as offerings in ceremonies. For example, they might be placed next to a grave. Some sculptures of tribal royalty were offered as gifts. For example, take a look at the bronze statue from the Kingdom of Benin in Nigeria. Okay, so traditional African cultures had to make their own clothing, starting with the thread. Wow, talk about building from the ground up. In addition to the obvious need of clothing for protection and to keep warm, African tribal textiles were and still are a large part of African art. One of the most common and complex types of textiles was that of the strip woven bold patterned cloth of Ghana. In most of Africa, the weavers were the men, while the women spun the thread. Weaving was tied to people's spiritual beliefs, with the exact symbolism differing among tribes. Another use of textiles was to identify different groups based on the pattern and colors of their clothing. So let's have a lesson summary. Now let's sum up what we've learned. The oldest known art is that of the African cultures that lived south of the Saharan desert. Its rich history gives us an insight into the earliest human existence on our planet. Their rituals, philosophies, and identities are portrayed in their masks, sculptures, statues, and textiles. Though these remains were learned that African tribal art was a very meaningful part of the society. It meant more than just a decoration of a means of self-expression, although it was used for those purposes too. By studying their art, we can learn about their everyday lives, their rituals, and the importance of honoring their ancestors. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe, comment down below for more information.